Hi, folks, with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the difference between the Western-educated, Western-prepared, Western, schooled and trained African presidents or leaders and the leaders that just come up out of the tribal sort of jungle and seize power or whatever. But comparing the two, because one has almost no Western schooling and tutelage and guidance and training, and the other has quite extensive Western guidance, tutelage and training. How does each of them, given their different sort of training and preparation, how does each of them behave once they attain the office of president or national leader or whatever it might be? Now, a friend of mine who's cutting down or trimming down on his very extensive book collection said, "Hey, Billy Bob's, any books you want there?" And so I had a little look through the ones he's throwing out, and he had some African history books, and one of them was a bit of a tome, a bit difficult to get through and very dry. You wouldn't read it for entertainment or anything. But I decided to have a look through it, and what I noticed, and it wasn't really highlighted in any of the books, was that there was effectively no difference between Western educated, trained and tutored African leaders, black African leaders, and the ones that again came out of the jungle, just sprung out of the ground from the tribes and had no Western influence. So just looking at a handful of them here, now they do come from tribes originally, but nonetheless, so at 16 years old, they're sent to, say, Britain, and this is the case particularly with Britain's African colonies and so on. The 16-year-old boy would be sent to Britain, to a expensive private school, so the very best, be a boarding school, and then he would go to university. I'm sure it was affirmative action, but some of these people supposedly were able to, get PhDs and this, that, and the next thing. I'd speculate on the rigor of their education there. Nonetheless, they're in a Western country. They can see Western ways of governance and prudential standards and so on. Levels of probity, this sort of thing. In government, and then they're because they're African leaders, they're then given the opportunity to work as like interns in say a parliamentarian's office, and whether it be at the local or the federal, British federal level. So now, because they come from a wealthy thing, they can live downtown in the nicest areas of London and so on. So, and they've got access to the very best in terms of, well, again, education and, but also access to the very center of government. Now, whilst Western government isn't perfect, the level of corruption these people later engage in, the murderous tyranny and so on, would be nothing that they saw in the West or in England, in Britain. So here we go, 16, and the kid then goes on again, 18, university, so seven years at university, and a couple of years as like an intern in local government offices. So they've been they've been in England for something close to 10 years. Then they go back to Africa, and within a relatively short space of time, maybe they're gifted some jobs or something like that, as political consultants or something. But anyway, then they go back to Africa. So at age 30, the guy becomes the president of some tin pot African country that the British have been running, and is very profitable and is got all the infrastructure there, the ports, the airports, the roads, the dams. It's got everything there to make a huge success of it. And the guy, now on top of that, when the guy goes back, he gets assigned British public servants to sort of act as ongoing tutors and advisors and this sort of thing. But within a relatively short space of time, The country goes to rack and ruin. It's in a state of mutinous civil war. The infrastructure's all fallen to pieces. The economy that was once, in terms of an African region, was once wealthy and so on, is now bankrupt. The guy lives like a fucking tyrant. He murders anybody that looks the wrong way at him, or so, and this sort of thing. So clearly, the benefit of a Western education and Western tutelage and Western advisors and all this sort of thing has somehow had no effect on him at all. He's reverted back to type, which is a goon guy who's just come out of the jungle and he wants to kill everybody and grab whatever he can and stuff it in his pockets. There appears to be no self-restraint. That again, the different tribes, he's antagonized them. The country's descended into civil war, and off it goes. So now you compare those sort of leaders, and there was a few of them. You compare those sort of leaders with folks that got no education at all in the West. They've never been to the West, never had the benefit of such tutelage, never been to expensive English private schools or universities. They've just, again, come straight out of the jungle and they're doing their murderous, tyrannical, destroy the economy thing, and again stuffing their pockets, stealing anything that isn't nailed down. So there's no difference between the two, or I couldn't discern it. I mean, now if you look at, say, South Africa, where the blacks inherited a very wealthy, very well run, very well administered, organized country, and they'd all had plenty of time to, they'd all been born into the white man's country, as in the administration and so on. They had an effective public service populated primarily by white people. So every available opportunity was there to make a go of it. You would have to work hard to fuck it up, and yet fuck it up they did. And there's no difference between the way they're behaving, maybe not the same murderous tyranny as you see in some of the other places, but in terms of their tribalness and their attitudes of stealing anything that isn't nailed down, and the how quickly South Africa has spiraled into being a failed state, and yet again there's no reason for it. All the education facilities, organisation, everything was there to make a success of it. But they're going down the same path as the African, tribal chieftain goon guy who swung out of the jungle. They're going down exactly that same path. Again, not quite as murderous, but that's the only thing that isn't yet in place, and you suspect it might be on the way. So when we look at this in its totality, we see that every African leader behaves more or less the same way, and maybe huge bribes from the United Nations may restrain them, but apart from that, they're all the same, and they all act in the same and behave in the same way. Now, the interesting thing, if you go around the world, wherever there is a black population, whether it's a minority population among whites, or it's like in Africa, it's the majority, the only population, the murder and crime rates stay remarkably consistent, whether it's, again, an American black people in, I don't know, Chicago or Baltimore or somewhere. That overall level of crime holds pretty constant no matter where there are black populations around the world, and holds pretty constant in what we see in Africa. So clearly the behavior, no matter what the education and so on, the behavior doesn't seem to change, or certainly not in many instances. Now, if we look at exposure to the behavior of black mayors and politicians in the United States, Tiffany Haynes, and those sort of people, they seem to go down exactly the same path as the African, but people who've never left Africa and never been out of Africa. So even though they've been in America for generations, the same behavior seems to come into play as soon as they get power, as soon as they've got access to money and things that they can grab and take and stuff in their pockets. The behavior doesn't appear to change or be different. Now, if you look at the sort of the movement of slaves to North America and I suppose the Caribbean more generally, but focusing on North America, the movement of slaves there was already in sharp decline in the late 1700s, early 1800s, already in considerable decline. And by the 1830s, it was very difficult to get slaves into the United States at all, and there was really just a trickle. Now, slaves who were already in the United States were procreating, so there was that. But in terms of new slaves, so really, 96%, 97% of the black population of America, United States, has been in the United States for at least 10 generations. So, and in many cases, much longer than that. So, when we look at why over that many generations living amongst white people has the white behavior, again, industry, working hard, passing, doing well at school, why is that not sort of, whether it be through some form of social osmosis, why is that not permeated the black population or has permeated so little of the black population? If you take away affirmative action senior high school diplomas and affirmative action university entrance and affirmative action degrees and all that sort of thing, there would be a minuscule proportion of the black population that would, let alone make it out of senior high school, would make it even to a basic sociology degree. So why is that when they've been among white people for so many generations? So, well, it's because they were slaves. So they haven't been slaves for 7 generations, 7 generations they've been slaves. So that doesn't wash up. Now you can play around with like Jim Crow, but they only applied to certain areas of the South. It didn't apply to the majority of the United States in the North. In fact, there was a Jim Crow state somewhere in the South. That doesn't affect Boston and New York and all these other places. So why weren't blacks doing much better there and compared to, and they weren't really, or not by any sort of substantial degree. So what's the situation? Why does the behaviour stay consistent no matter what external influences are applied, whether it be through education and tutelage and guidance and training and this thing and that, being other amongst white people? Now remember the black people who went to the UK for an education were an isolated black person amongst only white people, and they were in that way for 10 years. Yet, in spite of all that, as soon as they go back to Africa, they default straight to the tribal goon mentality and turn a very viable country into a failed state, and have no qualms about doing it. It was an interesting sort of observation, and one that I'm still wrapping my head around. You've been with Tassus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.